Welcome back. Still here with us is Ana Santos Rutschman from St. Louis University. Ana, thank you for staying with us. Going back to the trial for Elizabeth Holmes, there have been critics who've seen the trial as focusing more on fraud and less on the misled patients, that the people involved weren't necessarily held accountable for the social damage that they'd done. What do you make of that assessment, that the messaging for this trial has been wrong, to some degree at least?
I'm not sure I would characterize it as wrong. I think it caters to a part of the story. It did not cover every type of wrongdoing that Theranos should be accountable for. Theranos as a company, and something that I think would extend well beyond Elizabeth Holmes, for instance. The trial was largely focused on this idea of fraud. And again, that's what's at the heart of the problem, right? When Theranos misrepresents to different constituencies the properties of the test and says we have this technology, and they're not even, they were not even in some cases using their own proprietary technology. They were using third-party tests. When they say the science is there, we have the science to back up the claim that with just a drop of blood we can run these tests. They are defrauding people, and they're defrauding two categories of people. On the one hand, you have the investors, and we know that investors are extremely important, not just in Silicon Valley culture, and this is a Silicon Valley company, but in innovation, in biopharmaceutical innovation. So that's one piece of the puzzle. And that's mostly what the trial ended up boiling down to, because indeed, at least for now, as things stand, what the jury did find is that there had been wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud vis-a-vis the investors. So this is sort of where the trial leaves things at, and Ms. Holmes is widely expected to appeal, and we'll see, how the case might still proceed. But this is where we've gotten to in this story. Nothing has really come to pass in the other side of things, the relationship between this one startup company and then really big Silicon Valley company and patients. And part of the reason it's because we don't really have the laws in place to make that type of accountability have some teeth. And it's really complicated to structure those laws, because we need to balance two things. On the one hand, we do want some companies someday to come up with a technology that's properly vetted, that's peer reviewed, and that's safe and effective to use. And we need to give companies some wiggle room for this to happen. And we know that they have to take risks, and they have to seek capital for things that might not be fully developed initially. So there's some resistance to have laws that say, well, we're then going to punish a company that fails to do this, right? But what happened here was not just a mere scientific failure. There was fraud, right? So the trial made Theranos accountable, or Elizabeth Holmes accountable to the investors, but not to the patients. And that's really because we don't do that in the United States. At least it has not been a tradition that a company that behaves in ways that might be similar to this, sometimes not as egregious, but similar to this, we don't hold them liable for defrauding patients. We tend to think that regulators will look at the technology or at the labs, and then we see things as being separate. Investors, that's a different type of relationship, and those laws are very well developed. And that's a problem, but also it's something that's really hard to structure moving forward.
You touched on a lot of important points there. I wanted to start with the third-party tests and the innovation side of things that you brought up earlier. Theranos had a pretty tight lid on its data and its technology. Not a lot was known, at least in the early stages, well, publicly anyway. And it famously said that it was protecting trade secrets when, in fact, it was covering up elaborate fraud. Does this reshape the discussion around intellectual property protections and what companies can get away with, especially when it comes to the field of medical technologies?
Well, I think it sort of touches on some of the bigger issues around the interplay between intellectual property and medical or biomedical innovation. But I really don't think this is a story about intellectual property. The traditional problem with, at the intersection of intellectual property or trade secrets and these types of technologies that normally are vetted by the FDA in the US, but by similar regulators across the world, is that sometimes a lot of these data are not made available to other parties. Granted, typically there's some sort of peer review and publication that helps the process, but there's a lot of things that FDA or other agencies similar situated data that they look at and is never made available to anybody else. It's either formally a trade secret legally or is treated, pretty much as something that's proprietary and cannot be shared. Now, this can be extremely, extremely problematic. And the best illustration I can think of how this can be problematic is the case of COVID-19 vaccines, particularly the mRNA ones, right? They're so new that it's very, very hard to reverse engineer them, virtually impossible. And without some access to those data, then all these proprietary frameworks might prevent competition. What I think happened with Theranos is different, though. We don't want data to be kept secret. So that's, I would say, the point of contact. But it's not because there's some sort of intellectual property law that caused this to happen or because FDA looked at data and kept it under proprietary paradigms. The problem here is that data never made it to the FDA, and it should have. So I think that this illustrates problems with the data that sometimes relate to intellectual property, but I would not say that intellectual property is the main culprit here, or trade secrets are the main culprit here. It's really the lack of regulation, pre-market regulation.
Speaking of regulation in COVID-19, do you see any similarities and differences in perhaps how COVID-19 test kits, for example, were regulated versus these blood diagnostic kits? Because from what I understand, the FDA did hold off for quite a while at the start of the pandemic on these private labs developing their own test kits, and that did create a lot of issues, and perhaps it was even blamed for, hampering efforts to curb the pandemic. Do you see any similarities and differences? Because both of them broadly fall under the umbrella of lab developed tests.
You're absolutely right. It's the same type of technology. Sure, it's not squarely the same tests, but from a regulatory perspective, they fall under the same umbrella. So FDA is going to treat them pretty much the same way. And in the case of COVID-19 tests, by the time FDA expressed its initial position, that did not happen in a vacuum, right? So the Theranos story is not an isolated story in laboratory developed tests gone wrong. FDA ran a study in 2015, published a study in 2015, noting that there were multiple, they were not focusing on Theranos at the time, but they were identifying several companies that had faulty laboratory developed tests. So obviously there were going to be concerns early on in the pandemic. And all of us remember how, disconcerting those initial weeks and months were. So FDA was concerned that if the tests were faulty, as often LDTs can, laboratory developed tests can be, that would be undesirable. And then FDA had to act within the context of a pandemic. So I would not read too much into what happened with laboratory developed tests during the pandemic, because it is actually normal and probably a good thing that during a pandemic, the regulator behaves slightly different. Another parallel that you could be looking at here is the case of COVID-19 vaccines. Here in the US, as in many other countries, the vaccines were not fully approved when they came to market. They were authorized, which is a lower threshold. So I would be actually comfortable, provided that FDA weighs in, I'm actually comfortable with a lower threshold during a gigantic public health crisis, because we sometimes have to take some risks, and so do regulators. The really big concern is how the system gets this ingrained quality that it now has from mid-70s to 2022 at this point. We are not looking at these tests closely outside the context of a pandemic. And it's this, the more long-term scenario that really worries me with these tests.
Anna, obviously we could get into this discussion even more. There's a lot more to cover, obviously, but thank you so much for your insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's it from us here on All About Money. We'll see you again next week.